Chapter 7: Social Class, the Structure of Inequality. Social stratification and social inequality. Social stratification is the division of society into groups arranged in a social hierarchy. Every society has some form of stratification, but societies stratify people according to a variety of criteria, such as race, class, and gender. Social inequality is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, or prestige among members of a society. Social stratification is a characteristic of society. It persists over generations and is maintained through beliefs that are widely shared by members of society. In a stratified society, groups at the top of the hierarchy have greater access to goods and services than members of groups at the bottom. We find several different systems of stratification operating in the United States, where it is not hard to demonstrate that being wealthy, white, or male typically confers a higher status, and all that goes along with it, on a person than does being poor, non-white, or female. Because social inequality affects a person's life experience so profoundly, it is worthwhile to examine how stratification works. This is the Skeens from Pearland, Texas. What social class are they? This is the Thordarssons from Iceland. Can you tell what their stratification is? This is the Namgays from Bhutan. This is the Abdullahs from Kuwait City, Kuwait. This is the Kunquas from Thailand. This is the Natomas from Mali. Systems of stratification. Slavery is the most extreme form of social stratification and is based on the legal ownership of people. Slaves are not considered to be people, they are considered to be property of the slave owner. This is an extreme form of stratification because the individuals who are slaves have no access to pursuing the resources available in society and no opportunity for social mobility, which we will discuss in a few moments. Modern-day slavery persists, illegally, in many forms across the globe. Systems of stratification. A caste system is a form of social stratification in which status is determined by one's family history and background and cannot be changed. Apartheid is the term for the system of segregation of racial and ethnic groups that was legal in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. India is the country most closely associated with the caste system. Another example of a caste system was apartheid, the segregation of racial and ethnic groups that was legal in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. South Africans were legally classified into four main racial groups: white, English and Dutch heritage; Indian, from India; colored, mixed race; and black. Blacks formed a large majority, at 60% of the population. These groups were geographically and socially separated from one another. Blacks were forcibly removed from almost 80% of the country, which was reserved for the three main minority groups, and relocated to independent homelands similar to the Indian reservations in the United States. They could not enter other parts of the country without a pass, and if they did get a pass, it was usually in order to work as guest laborers in white areas. Ironically, African Americans visiting South Africa were given honorary white status and could move freely within white and non-white areas. Systems of stratification. Social class, a system of stratification based on access to resources such as wealth, property, power, and prestige. Sociologists often refer to social class as socioeconomic status, or SES. Intersectionality, a concept that identifies how different categories of inequality, class, race, and gender intersect. Social classes in the United States. The upper class is the wealthiest people in a class system, possess most of the wealth of the country, comprise 1% of the U.S. population. The upper middle class includes professionals and managers, makes up about 14% of the U.S. population. Social classes in the United States continued. Middle class includes white-collar workers, has a broad range of incomes, makes up about 30% of the U.S. population. The working, lower middle class includes blue-collar or service industry workers, is less likely to have college degrees, makes up about 30% of the U.S. population. Interestingly, most Americans would call themselves middle class, whether they make $25,000 per year or $250,000. Middle class seems to be a social norm that people want to identify with, even when they really are not part of that class. Social classes in the United States. Many poor people have lower levels of literacy than other classes. The working poor likely work manual and service jobs and seasonal employment, make up about 13% of the U.S. population. The underclass are likely employed part-time or unemployed, make up about 12% of the U.S. population. The U.S. social class ladders. On the left you have the class, starting at the top with upper class, upper middle class, working lower middle class, the working poor, and the underclass. And in the columns to the right, you have the percentage of population, typical household incomes, typical occupations, and typical education. Social class, conflict theory. Karl Marx believed that there were two main social classes in capitalistic societies. Capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production, workers, or proletariat, who sold their labor for wages. He believed that the classes would remain divided and social inequality would grow. Remember, Marx was a conflict theorist, meaning that he was interested in the conflict between these two classes. He believed that eventually the workers would revolt against the capitalists because of the oppression they felt. Social class, Weberian theory. Max Weber offered a similar model that also included cultural factors. He argued that class status was made of three components: wealth, or privilege, power, prestige. Sometimes this is referred to as the 3 Ps, or the three-pronged image of power. Wealth might be considered money and investments, earned or inherited. Power is political power or ability to make changes in the system. And prestige is a social honor people are given because of their membership in well-regarded social groups. Sometimes a person may have one of these, but not the others. But often the most powerful or successful people have all three. The relative social prestige of selected occupations in the United States. This chart lists white-collar occupations, a prestige score, and then blue-collar occupations. The highest score belonging to a physician of an 86 in the white-collar occupations, and in the blue-collar occupations, the athlete has the highest prestige score at 65. Social class, structural functional theory, suggests that the system of stratification that has emerged is functional to society in many ways. Certain roles are more important for the functioning of society, and these roles may be more difficult to fill, so more incentive is needed. Greater rewards are necessary for work that requires more training or skill. The functionalist perspective helps to explain the existing system of social stratification and its persistence, but it still leaves us with questions about the structural inequalities that the system continues to reproduce. For example, is it really functional for society for social rewards, such as wealth, power, and prestige, to be so unequally divided among members of society? Social class, postmodern theory. More recently, Pierre Bourdieu attempted to explain social reproduction. Social reproduction, the tendency for social class status to be passed down from one generation to the next. While we like to believe that our society has an open system in which people have social mobility, we can notice patterns that lack inter- and intragenerational mobility. We'll talk about all of these terms in upcoming slides, but the point is that we tend to notice trends where children reproduce their family's social class. Social class postmodern theory. According to Bourdieu, this happens because each generation acquires cultural capital, taste, habits, expectations, skills, knowledge, etc., which help us to gain advantages in society. This cultural capital either helps or hinders us as we become adults. For instance, it is very helpful for business people to know how to play golf, as many important business deals are struck on a golf course. Growing up in a family that can teach you that, how to play golf, can give you some cultural capital that will be very advantageous. Social class. Symbolic interaction theory. Symbolic interactionists examine the way we use status differences to categorize ourselves and others. As Irving Goffman pointed out, our clothing, speech, gestures, possessions, friends, and activities provide information about our socioeconomic status. You might notice that you wear similar brands of clothing or eat at similar restaurants as your friends. You'll also notice that there are other people who wear or eat things that are very different from what you wear or eat. These preferences might say something about the class that you belong to or associate with. Socioeconomic status and life chances. Belonging to a certain social class has profound consequences for individuals in all areas of life, including education, employment, and medical care. Think about which people in society tend to have greater access to these resources. Not everyone has an equal chance of getting into Harvard, being operated on by the best surgeon, or even becoming the President of the United States, despite what children are told in school. People also tend to marry those whose social and structural backgrounds are similar to their own, mainly because they are more likely to meet people like themselves. Social mobility. Social mobility is the movement of individuals or groups within the hierarchical system of social classes. A closed system is one in which there is very little opportunity to move from one class to another. An open system is one with ample opportunities to move from one class to another. America technically has an open system. It is legal and permissible for people to move between classes. But we can notice structural patterns where people tend to stay very close to the class that they were raised in. Social mobility. Intergenerational mobility is the movement between social classes that occurs from one generation to the next. Intragenerational mobility is the movement between social classes that occurs over the course of an individual's lifetime. An example of intergenerational mobility would be a plumber who has a daughter who becomes a doctor. There was class movement between the generations. An example of intragenerational mobility would be a man who is secretary but then goes back to school to become a lawyer. Mobility in that situation would be within his own lifetime and would likely change his social class. Social mobility. Horizontal social mobility is the occupational movement of individuals or groups within a social class. Vertical social mobility is the movement between social classes, and depending on the direction, is often called either upward mobility or downward mobility. Horizontal social mobility, which is fairly common, refers to the changing of jobs within a class. A therapist who shifts careers so that he can teach college experiences horizontal mobility. Vertical social mobility is movement up or down the social ladder, and thus is often called upward or downward mobility. If this same therapist marries a president of a large corporation, he might experience upward mobility. On the other hand, if he or his wife gets laid off, he might experience downward mobility. People are far more likely to experience horizontal than vertical social mobility. However, most Americans strive for upward social mobility. Social mobility. Structural mobility refers to changes in the social status of large numbers of people due to structural changes in society. Structural mobility occurs when broad-scale social changes occur, such as an economic recession or the expansion of higher education. Women entering the workplace during World War II is an example of a structural change that affected large numbers of people and families. During periods of economic recession, we may see downward social mobility for many people at once due to layoffs and company closures. Structural mobility helps to make sense of how individual lives are shaped by broader historical moments. That is, social mobility may be impacted by structural mobility. Poverty. In the United States, the federal poverty line, an absolute measure of annual income, is frequently used to determine who should be categorized as poor. The poverty threshold in 2015 for a family of 4 was $24,250. Most people living in poverty are not unemployed. This fact is evident in the term working poor. The number of people in poverty in the United States increased from 37 million, 12.6% of the population, in 2005 to 45.3 million, 14.5% of the population, in 2013. Poverty. Absolute deprivation is an objective measure of poverty that is defined by the inability to meet minimal standards for food, shelter, clothing, or health care. Relative deprivation is a relational measure of poverty based on the standards of living. People are considered poor if their standard of living is less than that of other members of society. Absolute deprivation. In this case, you feel poor because you can't meet minimal basic needs. You are comparing your salary to the cost of living. Relative deprivation. You might feel poor compared to others because they have more material possessions or spending power than you have. You are comparing your salary to the salary of others. Poverty in the United States by Selected Characteristics, 2013. Poverty. The culture of poverty refers to learned attitudes that can develop among poor communities and lead the poor to accept their fate rather than attempt to improve their situation. Invisibility of poverty. Residential segregation, political disenfranchisement, and the use of law enforcement to control the homeless can make poverty invisible to many Americans. One of the key criticisms of this theory is that it tends to blame the victims of poverty for their own misfortune while failing to take into account the structural factors that shape culture. However, it is worthwhile to discuss ways that society might help stop this cycle. For instance, if children aren't getting skills about financial management at home, could the schools intervene and give these children the skills they'll need to move into a higher social class? Inequality and the ideology of the American dream. The American dream is the ideology that anyone can achieve material success if he or she works hard enough. Explains and justifies economic inequality in our social system. Has been criticized for legitimizing stratification by implying that everyone has the same opportunity to get ahead. This idea of meritocracy, that hard work is justly rewarded, this notion tells us that success or failure depends on the person, when in reality we know that there are structural advantages and disadvantages that also contribute to an individual's success or failure. In upcoming chapters, we will discuss some of these structural issues. The American dream is exemplified in U.S. society by rags to riches success stories.